We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we are going to prove that the Assyrians were not African black. They weren't Africans, though they may have had some people amongst them that were African black or black, and they merged with them, and then they intermarried, had offspring, hybrids, half-breeds, Semites. There's always that possibility. But here is a wall relief on the front of this book, The Assyrian Empire, by Don Nardo, 1947. And sure, they have these plated beards. Could be just part of the wall art, or they actually had them like that. Very, very hard to plait your beard every day. But it's a skill, so they possibly did have that. We aren't going to say that there weren't any black people amongst them, because they could have merged, intermingled with other races, some being from Africa, being black, and then intermarried them, had offspring who were hybrids, half-breeds, half African, half Assyrian. There's always that possibility. Okay, but here on this wall relief, they are not African black. You can zoom in on there to have a better look. Okay, that is not African features. She looks a little bit, you might see a bit of a chubby African woman, but she doesn't really look African. Okay, even this little boy up here, hopefully that's a boy, not some sort of animal. Yeah, it looks like a little boy. They don't look African. Okay, they may have dark skin or a dark hue because they're in the sun all day. Look, they're not covered. So obviously, if it's a hot geographical location, the sun's going to come down on them, isn't it? If they were white, then their skin would have to evolve over time to adapt to that immense heat, or else they'd get skin cancer, etc., etc. They'll all be affected by it. So we're going to go and have a look at this particular book. It's part of the World History series, The Assyrian Empire by Don Nardo. Here is the contents page. Just going to move it over a bit. Forward. Each year on the first day of school, nearly every history teacher faces the task of explaining why his or her students should study history. One logical answer to this question is that exploring what happens in our past explains how the things we often take for granted, our customs, ideas and institutions came to be. As statesman and historian Winston Churchill put it, every nation or group of nations has its own tale to tell. Knowledge of the trials and struggles is necessary to all who would comprehend the problems, perils, challenges and opportunities which confront us today. Thus a study of history puts modern ideas and institutions in perspective. For example, through the founders of the United States were talented and creative thinkers. They clearly did not invent the concept of democracy. Instead, they adapted some democratic ideas that had originated in ancient Greece, and with which the Romans, the British and others had experimented. An exploration of these cultures then reveals their very real connection to us through institutions that continue to shape our daily lives. Another reason often given for studying history is the idea that lessons exist in the past from which contemporary societies can benefit and learn. This idea, although controversial, has always been an intriguing one for historians. Those who agree that society can benefit from the past often quote philosopher George Santayana's famous statement, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Historians who subscribe to Santayana's philosophy believe that, for example, studying the events that led up to the major world wars of other significant historical events would allow society to chart a different and more favourable course in the future. Just as difficult as convincing students to realise the importance of studying history is the search for useful and interesting supplementary materials that present historical events in a context that can be easily understood. The volume and Lucid Books World History series attempt to present a broad, balanced and penetrating view of the march of history. Ancient Egypt's important wars and rulers, for example, are presented against the rich and colourful backdrop of Egyptian religious, social and cultural developments. This series engages the reader by enhancing historical events with which these cultures context. With these cultural contexts. For example, in ancient Greece, the text covers the role of women in that society. Slavery is discussed in the Roman Empire, as well as how slaves earned their freedom. The numerous and varied aspects of everyday life in these and other societies are explored in each volume of the series. Additionally, the series covers the major political culture and philosophical ideas as the torch of civilization has passed from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt through Greece, Rome, medieval Europe and other world cultures to the modern day. The material in the series is formatted in a thorough, precise and organised manner. Each volume offers the reader a comprehensive and clearly written overview of an important historical event or period. The topic under discussion is placed in a broad historical context. For example, the Italian Renaissance begins with a discussion of the High Middle Ages and the loss of central control that allowed certain Italian cities to develop artistically. The book ends by looking forward to the Reformation and interpreting the societal changes that grew out of the Renaissance. Thus, students are not only involved in an historical era but also enveloped by the events leading up to that era. And the events following it. One important and unique feature in the World History series is the primary and secondary source quotations that richly supplement each volume. These quotes are useful in a number of ways. First, they allow students access to sources they would not normally be exposed to because of the difficulty and obscurity of the original source. The quotations range from interesting anecdotes to far-sighted cultural perspectives and are drawn from historical witnesses, both past and present. Second, the quotes demonstrate how and where historians themselves derive their information on the past as they strive to reach a consensus on historical events. Lastly, all of the quotes are footnoted, familiarizing students with the citation process and allowing them to verify quotes and / or look up the original sources or source if the quotes piques their interest. Finally, the books in the World History series provide a detailed launching point for further research. Each book contains a bibliography specifically geared towards student research. A second annotated bibliography introduces students to all the sources the author consulted when compiling the book. A chronology of important dates gives students an overview. At a glance of the topic covered, where applicable, a glossary of terms is included. In short, the series is designed not only to acquaint readers with the basics of history, but also to make them aware that their lives are a part of an ongoing human saga. Perhaps they will then come to the same realization as famed historian Arnold Toynbee. In his monumental book, A Study of History, he wrote about becoming aware of history, flowing through him in a mighty current, and of his own life, winding like a wave in the flow of this vast tide. Important dates in the history of the Assyrian Empire. People who lived and died by the sword. To the modern world before the mid-19th century, the name Assyria, which had once struck terror into the hearts of millions, was nothing more than a term occasionally mentioned in the Bible and the books of a few ancient Greek and Roman writers. According to these works, the Assyrians were one of several prosperous and powerful peoples who inhabited the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys in biblical times. This central and then very fertile region of the Near East is often referred to as Mesopotamia, a term derived from Greek words meaning the land between two rivers, or between the rivers. Like the Babylonians and other legendary Mesopotamian cultures, the Assyrians had long ago vanished from history's stage, and modern historians have had no way even to prove their existence, much less to locate their remains. This lack of concrete evidence stemmed mainly from an unfortunate choice of building materials. Unlike the Egyptians, Greeks and Romans, who constructed many of their monuments of durable stone, the Mesopotamians built mostly in mud brick, which disintegrates easily. The Near East's hot sun, periodic rains, annual floods, and shifting sand slowly levelled and buried the palaces and cities, leaving only shapeless earthen mounds. As the arid desert waste reclaimed them, these sites lost their original identities. For more than 2,000 years, their secrets remained concealed, even from the local descendants of those who had originally inhabited them. The veil of secrecy shrouding Assyria and its sister cultures began to lift in the 1840s as a series of young amateur archaeologists, mostly from France and England, rapidly uncovered one Assyrian palace and city after another. The most successful, famous and influential of these excavators was an English civil servant and adventurer named Austin Henry Layard. On a clear and quiet early November night in 1845, the 28-year-old Layard sat in a tent in the desert in what is now northern Iraq, an area then under Turkish control. Too excited to sleep, he could think of nothing else but the huge flat-topped and mysteriously earthen mound of Nimrud, beside which he was camped. Partly inspired by Frenchman Paul-Émile Botter's recent discovery of an ancient Assyrian palace at Khorsabad, about 50 miles to the north, Layard had come to Nimrud hoping to find sculptures and other artifacts for the prestigious British Museum in London. Layard's hope was transformed into reality in spectacular fashion on his very first day of digging. He and the 6 workmen he had hired from a local Arab chieftain began shoveling into the mound at dawn, and within 24 hours they had discovered rooms from 2 separate palaces, replete with magnificent sculptured wall reliefs. The young Englishman later described one of the vivid battle scenes depicted. 2 chariots drawn by horses were each occupied by a group of 3 warriors, and he goes on about that. And there's a relief, a drawing of a carved relief found at Nimrud, one of Assyria's chief cities, shows Assyrian warriors besieging an enemy fortress. A wheeled siege tower carries archers, and the fortunes. Oh, I can't see it, so small. And the fortress wall crumbles before a battering ram. So let's zoom in there. We're zooming out. Okay, look at that. No Africans there. No Negroes there. Okay. And that looks like a Dalek, but it's supposed to be a depiction of a fortress battering ram. Okay. They look very white there. Okay, it talks about hair and beads, but it doesn't say what colour they are or anything like that, anything deep like that. As more buildings at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, Nineveh, Assur and other Assyrian sites came to light, Layard and his successors found thousands of similar sculptures, a significant portion of them depicting warriors, weapons, battles, sieges and other military themes. This seemed to confirm what the Bible and other ancient works had said about the Assyrians, that they were the most warlike and feared of all ancient peoples. Yeah, because they'd march across country like the ground would shake because there's so many of them, and then they would invade and conquer, kill their enemies, and then put their heads up on the wall like the hunters do with those trophies of animals, deer and all that sort of stuff, right? Their catch. That's what they used to do. They were the most feared. Woe to the bloody city, wrote the Hebrew prophet Nahum in the Bible about Nineveh, all full of lies and booty. Behold, echoed another prophet Isaiah, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, destroying them utterly. Of truth, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. Those people, right? Their gods, particular pagan gods, their statues, etc. And the 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus spoke of the Assyrians as having been masters of Upper Asia over a period of 520 years, and of various peoples gallantly fighting to shake off the Assyrian yoke and become a free people. A century and a half of excavation supported by the translation of many Mesopotamian texts has revealed that the Assyrians were not merely ruthless destroyers, they were also prodigious builders, as the ruins of Nineveh and the other cities attest, as well as industrious farmers, traders and skilled artists. Yet the evidence shows that perhaps more than any other ancient nation, Assyria sustained itself through aggressive military raids, campaigns and wars, and more often than not it treated those it conquered with a bloodthirsty cruelty almost unique in humanity's recorded annals. This harsh policy led the Assyrians to power and glory as in the early centuries of the first millennium BC. They created the world's first large empire. In a number of respects, this realm became the model that later peoples, including the Persians, successfully copied in building their own empires. Moreover, by forcing the states of the Near East into a large scale unity, albeit an unstable one, Assyria made it easier for later conquerors to do the same. The Assyrians' ruthlessness, noted historian Chester Starr points out, shows the sternness required to break and harness the human and natural energies of the Near East. The Assyrian period was in reality one of the greatest turning points in the civilized history of this area. The next great empire, the Persian, reaped the benefit and could afford to exercise its sway in a more lenient style. But the Assyrians' stern and brutal methods as inevitably led to their doom. As a matter of course, their soldiers committed one cold-blooded atrocity after another, and the kings proudly boasted of these deeds. Many of the defeated I took as living captives, a 9th century BC Assyrian monarch recorded in his annals. And that's probably why God sent Jonah to them and said, look, you Assyrians, you're going to be under the wrath of God, you're going to get it, you better cut it out, turn from your sins. It's probably just one city though, because defeat is coming, something along those lines maybe. From some I cut off their hands and their fingers, and from others I cut off their noses, their ears and their fingers. Of many I put out the eyes. I made one pillar or pile of the living and another of heads, and I bound their heads to post stakes round about the city. The young men and maidens I burned in the fire. The city I destroyed, I devastated, I burned it with fire and consumed it. Not surprisingly, such heinous acts made bitter enemies at every turn. Eventually the strongest of these enemies banded together to rid the Near Eastern world of what all had come to see as its most deadly scourge. And just as Assyria had devastated and eradicated so many of its neighbours, that nation was itself finally and utterly erased from the winds swept north the Mesopotamian plains. Well, what happened was they had their times when they were strong, super strong, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, weak, strong, and then it wasn't up until I think it was Ashurbanipal when Assyria was at their weakest that they waxed strong, because he said, right, protect all the borders, keep out the Hittites, keep out the Israelites, etc., etc., which he did, right? And they waxed strong. But then when he died, the nation grew weak, and then they invaded their main city. There's too many of them, so these soldiers couldn't fight them off, right? Because they were getting attacked by the Hittites, the Israelites, whoever, left, right, centre, north, south, east, in all directions, and it was just too overpowering, and that's why they basically got destroyed. Perhaps the Kurds were jumping in there as well. And here is a fragment of an Assyrian war relief depicts soldiers delivering captured enemy heads to scribes, whose tally of these grisly trophies and other information about a recent battle would be delivered to the king. So there you go. There's no Africans, no black people there. Okay, even the heads aren't. Okay? Surely on a war relief somewhere there would have been, if there were Africans, black Africans in their army or amongst their people, they joined their military, they would have put them on the war reliefs. I don't think they were racist. They were just powerful, mighty warriors. No time to be racist, We've got a battle to put forth. We've got people to invade. If you're strong, a warrior type, we don't care what colour you are. some more information on the Assyrians. And it says here, in the epic sweep of the rise and fall of great people on those plains, the triumph and tragedy of the Assyrians stand out. A unique blend of heroic and horrific extremes. Their story is perhaps history's classic example of a people who lived and subsequently died by the sword. Assyria is there in Hell's pit, the Hebrew God told the prophet Ezekiel, and all her company, all of them slain, fallen by the sword, who spread terror in the land of the living. Layard captured the tragic irony of Assyria's fall from the heights of imperial power to the depths of obscurity in a different way, gazing on the huge stone torsos of winged lions that had guarded the portals of Nimrud's palaces. He remarked in hushed and wistful tones, for 25 centuries they had been hidden from the eye of man, and they now stood forth once more in their ancient majesty. But how changed was the scene around them. The luxury and civilization of a mighty nation had been succeeded by ruins and shapeless heaps of earth. Above the spacious hall in which they stood, the plough had passed, and the corn now waved. Between the great rivers, the early peoples of Mesopotamia. One of the great crossroads of the ancient world, the Near East, with the flat plains of Mesopotamia at its centre, witnessed the incessant rise and fall of city-states, kingdoms and great empires over the course of more than 4,000 years. Among these empires, the Assyrian was one of the largest, longest lived and most powerful, as well as the most feared. The success of Assyria and many other Near Eastern realms was significantly aided by the wide variety of terrains and climates in the area, which was bounded by the Arabian Desert and Persian Gulf in the south, the fertile Mediterranean coast of Palestine and Syria in the west, the Black Sea, mountainous Armenia and the Caspian Sea in the north, and the rugged highlands of the Zagros Mountains and Iranian Plateau in the east. The lands enclosed by these natural barriers featured many local regions that were very hospitable to settlement and the growth of large local population, according to the distinguished Assyriologist A. Leo Oppenheim. Along the rivers we find fertile oases like stretches such as those that appear here and there on the Tigris River and its tributaries, and especially on the Euphrates River, wherever the formation of the river banks make agriculture by irrigation possible. The flatlands and the narrow lands between the parallel chains of hills which ascend in ever higher ranges from the Piedmont Plain along the Tigris to the Alpine tops of the Zagros Mountains enjoy sufficient rainfall to ensure annual cereal crops and to produce an abundance of fruit juice. So it was the land of the Fertile Crescent. It really was. Early settlements of the Near East. These first cities were naturally enough preceded by villages and other much smaller settlements. For a long time, historians thought that the earliest, smallest and simplest Near Eastern settlements had grown up on the alluvial plains of the great rivers. It is now clear, however, that this assumption was wrong, and that the Near East's initial inhabited zone ran through the wide belt of foothills surrounding the Mesopotamian plains. This belt stretched in an arc from Palestine northward through Syria and eastern Anatolia, or Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, eastward across northern Iran and into the Iranian plateau. The growth of these settlements apparently coincided with, or was made possible by, the development of agriculture, perhaps as early as 9,000 or 10,000 BC. The inhabitants of the region, comments University of Oklahoma scholar Daniel Snell, learned that after a few years, grains increased in size when human beings planted, tended, and harvested them. Animals too changed some of their characteristics when they were domesticated, and both animal and plants were more convenient for people and more reliable than they had been before people were planting and managing them. Simply put, agriculture and herding provided more food, which in turn stimulated population growth and increased the size and complexity of human settlements. By the 8th millennium BC, some of these settlements had begun to protect themselves with defensive walls of brick and stone. The most famous early example is the town of Jericho in the Jordan Valley in Palestine, featuring stone defences enclosing an area of 11 acres. A large fortified village covering some 32 acres flourished in the 7th and 6th millennia BC at Cradle, Huyuk in southeast Anatolia. The town's square, flat roof houses, writes noted archaeologist Dr. Trevor Watkins, were built side by side like a pile of children's building blocks. pushed together. Access to each house was by means of a door at roof level, from which a steep ladder led down into the living area. Circulation, movement around the settlement was across the flat roofs. The edge of such a settlement would have presented a solid blank wall to any intruder or attacker. Once the ladders were drawn up, the settlement would have been impregnable. Katal, Hiliuk's military defences were likely designed to keep out local bands of marauders. However, they foreshadowed the large-scale international warfare that characterised the area later, especially in the second millennium BC, when it was part of the Hittite Empire, which vied with Assyria for dominance. Yeah, those Hittites, they like to try to invade and conquer. They tried that on the Egyptians as well. And talks about the Sumerian city-states. Eventually, perhaps by 5500 BC or so, the population of the upland regions had grown great enough to stimulate expansion southward into the Tigris and Euphrates plains. People may have perceived that their villages were getting too crowded. Snell suggests, even if they may not have been crowded at all by later standards, and so they moved out into the forbidding frontier area, which turned out to be extremely productive agriculturally. However, successful agriculture on the plains required considerable more work than it had in the hills, where rainfall was sufficient to water the crops. The plains were more arid, and people had to develop techniques for large-scale irrigation. Because out there it's really, really hot sun, desert, right? Fortunately, the Euphrates is a calm, slow-moving river that is relatively easy to divert into smaller channels, and a network of lush fields and prosperous villages rapidly grew on the riverbanks. That's why it was so fertile, right? They had so much plenty, they had abundance, right? And here is an ancient Mesopotamian statue made of terracotta and dating from the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, depicts a shepherd carrying a lamb. Okay, it's pretty basic. When we first saw it, it looked like an owl, some sort of bird. Didn't notice that was supposed to be a lamb. It looks more like a kitten. But yeah, it's very, very, very old, right? Here's the royal standard of Ur. Okay, looked at that. There's no dark people there, isn't there? Sumerian characters on a brick dated from about 2500 BC record the building of a religious temple by one of the kings of the prosperous city of Ur. Okay, it's got here of the thousands of cuneiform tablets discovered since the mid-1800s, the vast majority consist of dry administrative and financial records, including bills, accounts, received, inventories, volumes of barley or other foodstuffs, and measures of land parcels. They kept the inventory of all that they traded, etc., etc. Though monotonous, these reveal much about social customs and economic practices, especially among members of the upper classes who owned the land and controlled commerce or trade. On the other hand, some tablets preserve actual literature, the most important examples being the creation myths that became the common heritage of all Mesopotamian peoples, including the Assyrians. The most famous and influential of these myths appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This large compilation of early heroic tales and folklore, first collected into a unified whole circa or around 2000 BC by an unknown Babylonian scribe, centers on the exploits of the title character, who was probably originally a real Sumerian ruler or a king, and then legends built up around him. Gilgamesh searches long and hard for the secret of eternal life, only to find in the end that no human can escape old age and death. Along the way he has many adventures, including a meeting with Ut-Napishtim, i.e. the Noah of the Bible, whom the Sumerians called Zeusudra, who tells him the story of the Great Flood, an attempt by the gods to destroy the seed of humanity. Okay, it's talking about the flood in the Near Eastern region. It's not a universal flood. A lot of Christians think, oh, yeah, the flood destroyed everything, the whole world. You know, it was universal, it was global. No, disastrous floods in the Mesopotamian region, according to page 3, column G, Daily Life, page 3 of Timetables of History by Bernard Grun, the 3rd edition, based upon Fernstein's Culture Farplan. It's a chronology, the book of chronology, timetables of history. And there's more on the Epic of Gilgamesh. As is well known, more than 1,000 years later, the Hebrew scribes who compiled the books of the biblical Old Testament included their own version of the flood tale, changing the name of the ark's builder to Noah. Well, it was actually Noah in Palestine. It's like N, A, which sounded like Noah. Anyway, so other elements and motifs of the Gilgamesh story later filtered out of the Near East. Well, we actually read and put in a video earlier that it all came from the Hebrew. It's all from the Hebrew language, and then it went to the Sumerians, the Assyrians, etc. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, etc., etc. Okay? It's all from the Hebrew language, not the Sumerian, not the Akkadian, and not necessarily the Babylonian. And here is a wall relief. A drawing of an alabaster sculpture depicting the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh, said to have survived the Great Flood. Now that guy does not look African. Okay, he's holding a lion there. He definitely does not look African. He looks like he's got a tan or a dark hue. Okay, he sort of looks like Hector off Troy, a bit like that, right? But more beard plaited and all that sort of stuff. Probably a wig, maybe, who knows. But yeah, we would say he is a dark complexion or light brown complexion. Wouldn't say he was African black though, to put it bluntly. Okay, this is the creation of Gilgamesh's nemesis, religion and language. Like its cuneiform writing and epic literature, Sumer's gods and religious customs spread throughout Mesopotamia and other parts of the Near East, becoming more or less universal and surviving long after the Sumerians themselves had disappeared. Noted scholar of Mesopotamia culture George Jesru explains, for more than 3,000 years the religious ideas promoted by the Sumerians played an extraordinary part in the public and private life of the Mesopotamians, modelling their institutions, colouring their works of art and literature, pervading every form of activity from the highest functions of the kings to the day-to-day occupation of their subject. The fact that Sumerian society crystallised around temples had deep and lasting consequences. In theory, for instance, the land never ceased to belong to the gods, small g, and the mighty Assyrian monarchs whose empire extended from the Nile to the Caspian Sea. Okay, so they once ruled the Nile in the early 7th century BC, were the humble servants of their god Ashur, just as the governors of Lagash, who ruled over a few square miles of Sumer, were those of their god Ningersu. The most revered of the Sumerian gods were An, or Anu, whose main temple was in Uruk. Sovereign of the universe, Enlil, his worship centered in Nippur, creator and ruler of earth, Enki, god of the waters, and Enzu, Utu, and Inanna, or Nini, deities of the moon, sun, and planet Venus, respectively. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and other peoples who succeeded the Sumerians in the region and adopted their culture also borrowed these gods, sometimes changing their names. Thus, Enki became Ea, Enzu became Sin, Utu became Shamash, and Inanna became Ishtar in later Mesopotamian pantheons. That's a series of many gods, little g's. At the same time, the Babylonians identified their chief god Marduk, and the Assyrians the god Ashur, with the Sumerian Enlil. These gods, like those of the later Greeks and Romans, were seen as having human form as well as human qualities, frailties and passions. In brief, says Ru, they represented the best and worst of human nature on a superhuman scale. The Sumerian language also survived Sumer's political decline in the late 3rd millennium BC. Although Sumerian was no longer widely spoken after 2000 BC, it survived as a sort of sacred literary language, just as Latin became for the Catholic Church and the European scholarly community after it ceased to be spoken. The spoken language that immediately replaced Sumerian throughout Mesopotamia was Akkadian, and a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew and Arabic. Akkadian speakers had long inhabited the central and northern reaches of Tigris Euphrates plains, and they eventually gained dominance over the Sumerian city-states in the south. The Akkadians easily adopted the Sumerians' cuneiform writing system to their own tongue, which shows that system flexibility, since the two languages are as different from each other as Latin is from Chinese. It must be stressed that the Akkadians were not a separate race, a separate racial, ethnic or social group. Ethnic divisions played little part in major ancient Near Eastern societies, states H.W.F. Saggs, an expert on ancient languages. So it's sort of hinting that the language was basically from the Hebrew. Who was that? Yeah, it's related to the Hebrew and Arabic. Okay. Of course, Arabic would be if it's pretty much Syriac, like a clone of the Syriac. Warfare and conquest. The Near East in 3rd millennium BC. In Asia Minor, Arabian Desert. Here's Ashur, Phoenicia, Palestine, Egypt way over here. See how you have these seas here? Mediterranean Sea, then the Red Sea, etc. Black Sea, Caspian Sea way over here. All of this was one giant landmass, according to this video we did, until the tectonic plates shifted, caused a crack, caused a volcanic eruption, molten lava to flow, and then the lands were separated, and then you get these waters, these seas in between, right, which divides these geographical locations, these ones that came later. So, like this guy did in this video, he fitted all the countries together, and as he also said on the Israeli tour board we was talking from, this Pan-African narrator said it was all joined, it was all one. So Israel, this area here, Palestine, etc., was part of Africa, but they weren't necessarily Africans. Okay? Because if some people were born here when these were established, they're not going to be Africans, are they? They're going to be Asherites or Elamites. Yeah? They're not going to be Egyptians or Africans. Yeah? But as we said, all this area here was supposedly, according to this guy's evidence and admittance by the Hebrew Israeli in their language, it was all Africa. It was all one. Imagine it without any seas. It's just one giant landmass. Here is a bronze bust of the great conqueror Sargon I. So that's basically hit in his likeness, right? He's sort of got like African lips there, right? But no, he's probably got a dark hue, but he may not necessarily have been African black. Okay. Dream of uniting Mesopotamia. Sargon and his heirs must have mastered all of these weapons and methods, however they did not have a monopoly on them. Weakened by wars with neighbouring peoples who had their own strong armies, and undoubtedly by other factors unknown, shortly after 2200 BC, the Akkadian realm suddenly collapsed. In the next few centuries witnessed ongoing struggles for control of the river plains among various peoples, including Elamites, Guti, hill people from the region north of Elam, Amorites from western Mesopotamia. Those are the... is that possibly the Arameans? Not too sure anyway. And a few surviving Sumerian cities, and so forth. A duty to conquer and rule. The rise of the Assyrian nation, that's when they became strong, and they were feared, and that's the reason why. Ashur's first great dynasty. Babylonian interlude. And then royal sibling squabbles. Royalty fighting with royalty. Hammurabi's Code, which probably was the influence of King Shuruppak. If that came before, then that's what that Shuruppak laws were probably influenced by. The Hammurabi's Code, or if this came after it, then vice versa. You haven't seen any information here on it, on the king of Shuruppak. The first great period of expansion. And a horde of unknown barbarians attacks the northern fringes of Assyrian territory. Somehow Assyria managed to survive the devastating upheavals that erased Hatti from the map and overthrew many of the most powerful cities of the western Near East in about 1200 BC. See? There's no African looking people in that one. Okay. Probably Hittites, something like that. A sudden catastrophe. Here's some more reliefs. And they hung their victims, their people they invaded, on stakes. It looks like it's actually through them. Looks like the gas or something. Might be from an orifice, you know, something like that. Like what's his name? The Dracula guy, Vlad the Impaler. Vanquishing the enemies of Ashur. Get rid of them all. A name once more to be reborn. Dreaded Assyria is reborn. The 5 rows of relief on this black obelisk, commemorating the victories of King Shalmaneser III, depict vanquished peoples offering him tribute. Among these defeated enemies is Jehu, king of Israel. A ruler not to be trifled with. A harsh and ruthless method used by the first great monarch of the new empire, Assur-Nasirpal II, around 883 to 859 BC. Tukulti-Ninurta's son made Assyria once more a name to be dreaded in the Near East. After consolidating his father's gains in about 877 BC, the new king boldly marched his forces westward and hoping to do what no other Assyrian monarch had done since the mighty Tiglath-Pileser, more than 2 centuries before, reached the Mediterranean shores. Assur-Nasirpal first fought his way through Aramaean-held territory until he reached Carchemish on the west bank of the upper Euphrates. His detailed annals, many of which have survived, tell how he then continued westward, covering approximately 20 miles a day, crossed the Orontes River, and finally reached the Great Sea. So he's very, very determined. 20 miles a day. Damn, he's pushing it hard. The main instrument of the cruelty displayed by Assur-Nasirpal and his successors was, of course, the strong, well-organised and brutally efficient Assyrian army. In this early period of the new empire, that army's ranks were filled in large degree by a levy of native Assyrians who were drafted into service at the start of a campaign and returned to their farming or other labours at the campaign's end. A branch of the civil service was devoted to keeping census records of the empire's towns and villages to facilitate quick and efficient mobilisation of manpower. Those called up were sometimes used on large commercial projects such as building palaces or digging canals. As more foreign peoples came under imperial control, vassal rulers were obliged to supply men for the army's auxiliary units, and some mercenaries, including Aramaeans, were also used. Okay, so they would have invaded other peoples, and then those other people would have been used to, they were basically subjects to Assyria at that time, even the Aramaeans. So that's probably where you could have got your mixture, right? They might have merged, intermarried with these different peoples, these foreign peoples, and then they had halflings, right? Hybrids, half-breeds. unless they were very national and didn't do that sort of thing, right? Here's a depiction of them, a modern rendering of Assyrian soldiers. Okay, that's a modern version. You know, he's cut somebody's head off. Okay, presenting it to somebody, holding a severed head. Comradeships and arms. Here's the siege tower. Assyrians were famous for their prowess in siege warfare, and as evidenced by this rendering of a stone relief showing a siege tower which is attached with attached battering rams. Many later peoples emulated Assyrians' siege techniques. Yeah, they copied it, right? Looks like a freaking Dalek. Exterminate, exterminate, exterminate. So that's probably where Doctor Who got the Dalek from. The Assyrians. Tiglath-Pileser's reforms. A limestone bas-relief dated to the 7th century BC shows the head of Tiglath-Pileser III, one of the most effective and successful of all Assyrian kings. Sargon and its ears, or its heads, chiefs, the Assyrian Empire at its height. Another wall relief, or King Sargon II. Sennacherib. There's another wall relief. Assyrian slingers, they hurl rocks at the fortified Jewish towns of Lachish. In this relief from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. And there's this palace without rival at Nineveh. It sprawls along the banks of the Tigris River in this modern restoration. Well, it's a redrawing of what it probably looked like. A drawing of what it probably looked like. Recreation. A message in stone. It's a hat-on around 680, 669, ascending the throne after fighting and defeating his brothers. He's Ashurbanipal. 668, 627. Inherited from his father the Assyrian Empire at its height, a vast realm stretching from the Nile Valley in the southwest to central Armenia in the north. So they controlled Egypt, the valley, the Nile Valley, right? By the looks of it. That realm was far from stable, of course, since Egypt was in open rebellion, and the new king realised that he had to crush the rebels as fast as possible, so he hastily made his way through Syria and Palestine, gathering troops from the subject states along the way, and entered Egypt. There, according to his annals, Taharqa, king of Egypt, heard of this advance of my army in Memphis and mustered his fighting men against me, offering armed resistance and battle. With the help of Ashur and the great gods who advanced at my side, I defeated his army in a battle and on the open plain. The terrible splendour of Ashur and Ishtar overcame him, and he went mad. He forsook Memphis and fled to Thebes. The Assyrians pursued Taharqa to Thebes, located several hundred miles south upstream and therefore in Upper Egypt, which had so far remained outside the zone of Assyrian control. Taharqa fled again and about 2 years later died in exile. His son, Tanu-Atamun, then took up his cause. As soon as the main body of the Assyrian army had vacated the country, the young man gathered some patriotic native forces, marched north and boldly liberated Memphis. But his triumph proved short-lived. Ashurbanipal entered Egypt a second time, retook Memphis and proceeded to sack and destroy Thebes. The tables were turned still again. However, when about 10 years later, in 655 BC, another Egyptian patriot, Psamtik or Psamtikis, succeeded in driving the Assyrian occupation forces out of the country, chasing them all the way to Ashdod in Palestine. And as Assyrian monarchs so often did, as a matter of course, Ashurbanipal would probably have attempted to put down this new rebellion. But at that moment he was involved in a major war for Elam, and on the southern eastern front he managed to drive the Elamites back into their own country in fairly short order. No sooner had he done so, however, when the region flared up again. This time the troubled spot was Babylon, and the culprit was Ashurbanipal's own brother, Shamash-shumukin. On becoming king, Ashurbanipal had agreed to his father's dying wish, namely to allow Shamash-shumukin to sit on the Babylonian throne with authority second only to the imperial ruler in Nineveh. This arrangement had worked for 17 years, but in that interval Shamash-shum-ukin had become Babylonianized, estranged from Assyrian affairs, and now wanted to fight his brother for ultimate power over the Near East. Ashurbanipal must be given credit for attempting to defuse the crisis non-violently, because that was his brother, right? In a carefully worded appeal to the Babylonian people, he stated, "I have heard all these empty words which that unbrotherly brother of mine has told you. They are but wind. Do not believe him. Now, by all means, do not listen to his empty words. Do not spoil your reputation, which is so good in my own eyes and in the eyes of all the countries, and do not sin against the God. I am writing to you that you should not sully yourselves through this affair." For reasons unknown, the Babylonians rejected this offer of conciliation, and full-scale war soon broke out. Some Babylonian towns backed Shamash-shum-ukin, while others were wisely sided with Ashurbanipal, who clearly had the best chance of winning. The ancient town of Ur, for instance, sent this appeal to the Assyrian king. There's not a city there in the region of Akkad which has remained loyal to Assyria except Ur and Kisik and Shetina, and the king of our Lord knows that Ur has been upright loyal in the midst of Akkad. From there, carries on. But the land did not slip from Ashurbanipal's hand. After 3 years of bloodshed, the rebellion collapsed, and Shamash-shum-ukin, in despair, set fire to his own palace and died in the blaze. He committed suicide, right? Beginning of the end. Not long after regaining control of Babylonia, Assyria found itself in another war with Elam. Never ends. This time that nation received the full brunt of Ashurbanipal's unleashed wrath, as his army swept into its heartland and in a terrifying orgy of destruction, quite literally erased it from the face of the earth. Thus did the 3,000-year-old rivalry between Elam and the peoples of Mesopotamia end with frightening suddenness and finality. Ironically, this pivotal event turned out to be Assyria's great turning point, the beginning of its own sudden and final end. Late in 639 BC, the very year that Elam ceased to exist, Ashurbanipal's raw annals fell silent, leaving the last 12 years of his reign in utter darkness, at least from the Assyrian vantage. Scattered foreign sources suggest that a combination of invasions, rebellions and civil strife on a scale larger than the Assyrians had ever experienced began to engulf their empire. This approaching apocalypse was perhaps inevitable. The truth, after all, was that every one of Assyria's subject states and foreign neighbours hated Assyria and would gain from its elimination. Those who were familiar with the Jewish prophecy of the time must have longed to see its fulfillment. All who look on you, Assyrians, will shrink from you and say, "Wasted is Nineveh. Who will bemoan her? The fire will devour you, the swords will cut you off. All who hear the news of your destruction will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil." Here's another relief from Ashurbanipal's palace. Assyrian warriors take a meal break during their siege of the Aramaic city of Hamanu. A society subservient to gods and kings, Assyrian life and culture. Assyrian high priest left as king. So that's what they look like. His life no longer his own. Here's another wall relief. Ashurbanipal stands in his royal chariot in this wall relief found in his palace at Nineveh. Apparently he's a bookworm, or a tablet worm, and he had this fantastic library built and told all his sent out some emissaries to go get the original copies of these tablets if they could, or if they couldn't, just come back with a copy.